So Lena is a City of Milwaukee native who started her role as Voter Services Co-Chair in January of 2021 with the League of Women Voters. She serves as Chief Election Inspector for the City of Milwaukee, a league observer with the UCLA of Wisconsin, and was a nonpartisan observer with the League of Women Voters during the recent recount in Milwaukee County. Additionally, Lena has served as a volunteer in many campaigns, has spoken in front of Senate, Assembly, and Joint Finance Committee in Wisconsin, and has been a part of various advocacy efforts. So she's going to be sharing a little bit today and relating the work of adult literacy to her own work. And I will leave the floor to her.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm super excited to be here. Like Madison said, I'm representing, really, we got this opportunity through the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County, which I am absolutely going to put a plug in for. So if you didn't want to hear about it, kind of too bad. I'm getting it in right away for you. I'm going to turn my camera off because one of my cats, I was telling Madison before this, she loves to be on camera. And as much as I would love for her to be front and center during this presentation, I'm going to be often moving her out of the way. So I just don't want to distract anybody. I will turn my camera back on later though, for any sort of question, Q&A time as well. If anybody has questions during the presentation, Madison, I'm not sure how you normally do this. If you have people put questions in the chat, if you have any advice for folks that way.
We can do whatever you'd prefer today. If you'd like to, you can have the questions in the chat. Otherwise, we do have a smaller group today, so that's up to you.
Lovely. Okay. I would say if folks want to put questions in the chat, that would be easiest. That way we can kind of circle back around to them.
I can interrupt you as we go.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Lena, can you speak a little more loudly, please?
Yeah, I sure can. I can.
Thank you.
Absolutely try to. Let me know if this is good or not. I'm happy to do some yelling at my computer. I'm a quiet talker, so I do apologize for that. If anybody has any issues with the level of my volume, please just feel free, like you did, and let me know that I need to be a little louder. So, without further ado, let's get started. Like I said, I'm so excited to be here to talk voting rights and literacy. The work you all do with Literacy Services of Wisconsin is so important. And voting is so important. I love voting and I love talking about it. So I'm so excited to be here. Like I mentioned, I'm going to have to put a plug in for the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. That is who I am working with, really volunteering with, and here representing. So the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County is part of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And what the League does is we encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues. And of course, we do minimize this and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Our members have taken an active role in making democracy work since the League was formed in 1920. We are a nonpartisan organization. So like Madison mentioned, when I was doing that nonpartisan observing of the recount, which was so exciting in the fall. So that means that we don't support or oppose candidates or political parties at all. So we truly are nonpartisan in the fact that we just want to make sure that voters are educated, registered, know what they need to do when they get to the polls on voting day, and of course be able to be active.
Lena, sorry to interrupt you here. It seems like you're kind of coming in and out of the volume. I'm wondering.
Oh no.
If you can maybe readjust your position towards the mic or.
Sure. Absolutely. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Is this better?
Yeah, this sounds good.
Okay, lovely. Sorry to all the folks at home. I do apologize for that. So I'm not sure what I all missed out on or what you all missed out on hearing, but essentially our goal is to make citizens active in the political process from registration all the way through advocacy work. Our mission is empowering voters, defending democracy. Super cool mission statement. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate in this process. And we believe in the power of women, but also men. I'll plug also men. We do have men in the league to create a more perfect democracy. And of course, you can find out more about the League of Women Voters. And if you choose to be a member, definitely check it out. You can find our membership information on our website as well. That's my plug. So to start off, I always love giving some quotes, and you'll see some quotes throughout this presentation, just because I feel like they can be so powerful. And John Lewis, especially, he's going to be very relevant throughout this presentation. But I love this: the vote is precious. It's the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. So what we're going to be doing today is going through a timeline of events. And yes, there are a lot of dates on here, and there are a lot more dates throughout this presentation as well. So if you are someone who maybe wasn't super jazzed about history in high school, I'm so sorry. I'm definitely going to be doing a little bit of a history presentation here. We're starting off all the way back, 1776, in the beginning, Declaration of Independence, United States founding. Going to touch, of course, about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, mentioning more recent things, Voting Rights Act rollback, in case you didn't know about that, and then 2021 and beyond. So looking at voter suppression, and of course, invigoration, and the types of things that we want to see moving forward. So let's get this history lesson started. Starting way back, like I mentioned, 1776, Declaration of Independence. So the right to vote during the colonial and revolutionary periods was restricted to property owners. Sure, some folks know this. Perhaps you think of, the old school, way back in the day, farmers, landowning individuals, white male Protestants over the age of 21. Moving then, kind of our next milestone is 1787. This is when, although the US Constitution has not been fully adopted by all parts of the, not the Union at this point, but really I'm going to say the Union. At this point, this set the tone for what states can do and what the federal government is or is not going to do. So the adoption of the Constitution made way for no federal voting standards because there's no agreement on a national standard. Much like the Constitution, much like what we got going on now, there's a lot of power that states have to decide what they're going to do. And that wasn't any different when it came to voting laws. Most cases, again, voting remains in the hands of those white male landowners, because those are the folks who can vote and who are making the laws. And also the Electoral College is established at this point. We all kind of know how the Electoral College goes. It's still around, still kind of old school as it will be. Moving forward to 1789. In case you did not know this guy, George Washington, our first president, he was elected president. And at this point, the only reason I bring this up is because at this point in time, only 6% of the United States population was eligible to vote based off of those initial established guidelines of 21 or older landowner. So really, out of the entire population that had come over and established the United States, only 6% was eligible to vote. In 1790, we have a naturalization law that was passed, and you're going to see a few of these as we go throughout history. Who becomes a citizen? Who can vote? Once you're a citizen, does that mean that you can vote? There are lots of different things that citizenship can mean. So in the 1790, naturalization law, it explicitly stated that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. So not establishing necessarily any voting protections, but just establishing who is considered a citizen of the United States at that point, or the colonies, right? Moving right along to the 1800s, moving super fast here. 1810, religious freedom. You know, I think when we talk about the United States, a lot of the times way back when, we're saying, yeah, they wanted to get away from a lot of the religious persecution. You know, folks were fleeing and looking for somewhere else to be where they could truly be free. Well, this is, I think, probably a little known fact, something that I actually don't remember learning about, but Catholics and Jews were finally kind of given the okay to vote in 1810. Before that, there were guidelines that states put into place where they could not vote. And you'll see a lot of it has to do with where these people are coming from as immigrants. But 1810 really marks the point where we're saying, okay, well, we said that we have religious freedom in the colonies, and now we're finally doing that. In 1848, there are a few things that happen. Lots and lots of things are going on at this point in time, but this is really a period of a lot of movement. A lot of people are starting to make waves in talking about voting. There's a women's right convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick Douglass, hopefully we all know who he is. He attends this convention and gives a speech supporting universal voting rights. His speech helps convince the convention to adopt a resolution calling for voting rights for women. It's interesting, and maybe everybody on this call already knew this, but it's interesting that Frederick Douglass, as a Black man, former slave, right, was not going into it right away with saying, hey, we need to get the Black man vote, but really we should start with and talk about the women's vote. Additionally, in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, and this guaranteed U.S. citizenship to Mexicans living in the territories conquered by the United States. Now, English language requirements and also voter intimidation really limited that voting accessibility. So even though they were citizens, perhaps they could have still fallen into those ranges for eligible to vote. Because of a lot of language barriers, they weren't able to participate even if they really wanted to. 1855, literacy tests are born, and we'll talk more about these. I know we've all heard of these, and I have always associated these with the Jim Crow era, always, always, and forever. But it is so interesting that literacy tests were actually born in Connecticut. So Connecticut was the first state to establish literacy tests for voting. Massachusetts then picked that up after that, and initially used to discriminate against Irish Catholic immigrants. Like I mentioned before, in 1810, Catholics and Jews finally allowed to vote. But so these were put into place initially to discriminate against them, but other states saw these literacy tests and said, you know what, these might be a good idea. Who do we really want voting? Who do we want in power? And how can we make it so that the voices we want to hear are amplified and the voices that we don't want to hear are not, right? So out of all the places that we associate literacy tests, Connecticut is definitely not one of them, but that is the place where it's born. Continuing on the 1800s, again, a lot of stuff's going on there. 1856, the requirement for property ownership was removed for the requirements for voting. So congratulations, if you are a white male on this call right now, then 1856 is the year that you can celebrate if you are not a property owner of being able to vote. North Carolina was the last state to remove this requirement out of the colonies, but everyone else did move forward with abolishing that requirement. Jumping forward then, 12 years, we've got the 14th Amendment. If you didn't know what the 14th Amendment was, that is A-OK. That granted citizenship and to former slaves, right? So 14th Amendment, citizenship defined and granted former slaves. Citizenship can no longer be denied. However, voting can and was. Although the amendment forbid states from denying any rights of citizenship, like I mentioned, those voting regulations were still left in the hands of states. So just like everything else, they could kind of do what they wanted to do. It's going to be different in every state. A lot of states didn't want former slaves to be able to vote. So what did they do? Not allow them to vote. In 1870, we have the 15th Amendment that was adopted, and that explicitly states that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, right? So just a couple of years after allowing them to be citizens, saying, okay, we can no longer deny folks based on race. However, we've got some additional suppression tactics that began. States enacted things like voting taxes. Again, those literacy tests were really, really popular. And those restricted the actual ability of African Americans, especially, to be able to vote. Violence and other intimidation tactics, of course, were also used during this time. In 1872, women try and fail. I hate to say it, but they absolutely tried and were not able to vote. So Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth, hopefully big names that you know, both appear, my apologies, at voting polling sites to cast their ballots. Susan was arrested and brought to trial, and Sojourner was just turned away. But of course, throughout that movement, and throughout this time in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s even, they're working towards that right to vote, especially for women. In 1876, the Supreme Court decided that Native Americans were not citizens as defined by the 14th Amendment and therefore could not vote. Obviously, there was a large population, a large indigenous population, right? The colonists moved in and kicked a bunch of people out. And folks that were still living in the areas were still doing everything like everybody else, right? You're still going to the store, still going to whatever it may be, but really defined by the 14th Amendment, they were not considered citizens and therefore couldn't participate in that process. In 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed, and this bars people of Chinese ancestry from naturalizing to become US citizens. Again, we're going to see this as a pattern of barring people from becoming citizens, barring people from voting. Keep in mind right now, we still only have white men over the age of 21 really eligible to vote at this point. In 1887, we have the Dawes Act, and this granted citizenship to Native Americans who gave up their tribal affiliation. So if they truly wanted to assimilate into colonial culture and give up that tribal affiliation to be what I think most people would look at as more American, right? Then they could do that. Does it give them the right to vote? Does it not? Kind of depends on the place, right? As we keep saying. In 1890, we had some small wins as a country. So in Wyoming was admitted to the Union, became a state, and they became the first state to legislate voting for women. So very, very exciting. Wyoming out of all of them, right? kind of an interesting place to do so. And then also the Indian Naturalization Act was passed, which granted citizenship to Native Americans whose applications were approved. So they had to go through a citizenship process, much like the one that we have today. They have to apply for citizenship and be approved for that. Moving on to the 1900s, of course, as many of us have probably seen, women were marching through the streets in the early 1900s, 1912, 1913, got our awesome sashes on, votes for women, leading those marches through New York and Washington, D.C. And finally, while we're not quite there yet for women, we do make a step forward for Native Americans. So for some Native Americans who opted not to give up that tribal affiliation, who perhaps did not apply to be a citizen yet, they were granted, could be granted citizenship if they served in the military during World War I. So anyone who had that military service was granted citizenship. Very exciting stuff. 1920, party year, 19th Amendment was adopted. Of course, this gave women the right to vote in both state and federal election. Super duper exciting. And I also see a typo, so I'm going to fix that before we get this sent out to you guys. So, of course, women have been working on this for how many years now, right? But so have others. And finally comes a time when they are given the right to vote in both those state and federal elections, which is really, really exciting and important. In 1922, we have another ruling on citizenship from the Supreme Court, and they ruled that people of Japanese heritage were ineligible to become naturalized citizens. In 1923, the court finds that Asian Indians are also not eligible. So again, going back to our Exclusion Acts, going back to pushing additional people out of that eligibility bubble, we've got now Japanese, Chinese, trying to think of everyone else, Asian Indians added to this mix of people who are not eligible to be citizens, and therefore eventually not eligible to vote, right? In 1924, we're looking at, hey, we've got citizenship granted for additional people. Very exciting. The Indian Citizenship Act grants citizenship to all Native Americans. Huge, huge movement. However, many states made laws and policies that prohibited them from voting. So, citizenship without that voting. In 1925, we have military service, more military service for Filipinos. So any Filipino who was living in the United States could only be granted citizenship if they have served for 3 years in the Navy. Very interesting. You know, any military service, sometimes we look at that of you're serving your country. At that point in time, they said, hey, has to be 3 years in the Navy. There are all sorts of things that are happening between 1925 and 1947. I don't want to bore you with all of them because I'm throwing so many dates at you already. But in 1926, there was a huge, I would say huge event in Birmingham, Alabama, where a group of African American women were attempting to register to vote. And they were beaten by election officials. So the people who were working to help people register to vote, to help them vote, physically assaulted these women. So pretty big deal. But throughout this whole period of time, you're seeing more and more of those physical altercations. In 1947, we have some legal barriers that were removed for Native Americans because of this gentleman, Miguel. He was a former Marine living in New Mexico, and he sued them, and he won. Very exciting. And after winning that lawsuit, New Mexico and Arizona were required to give the vote to all Native Americans in that area. again, we had talked about how Native Americans were given citizenship, but still not that availability or eligibility to vote. In 1952, Mccarran Walter Act grants all people of Asian ancestry the right to become citizens. So kind of undoing some of those things that we had done in the past to intentionally bar people from becoming citizens. Now we're opening the door to them. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment was adopted, and this is giving residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for U.S. president. To this day, as I'm sure many of you know, the district's residents, most of whom are African American, are not eligible. They can't vote for other representatives because they don't have any. So it truly is taxation without representation. If we want to go way back to our founding fathers, really Washington, D.C., they don't have that same representation like the rest of the states do. Whew. Are we quite yet through the 1900s? I don't think so. In 1963, we have a focus of voting rights as civil rights. There are huge efforts in the South to register African Americans to vote. State officials are using tactics to refuse registration and voting. Like I mentioned before, voting taxes, literacy tests, and of course, violence and intimidation. Among efforts launched is Freedom Summer, where close to 1,000 civil rights workers of all races and backgrounds converge on the South to support voting rights. In 1964, we see another win with the 24th Amendment adopted. And this is guaranteeing the right to vote in federal elections. And you cannot be denied for failure to pay any tax. So when we're talking about those voting taxes or poll taxes, they could no longer be denied for not paying those things. The big one, 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. So this act forbids states from imposing discriminatory restrictions on who can vote and provided mechanisms for the federal government to enforce its provisions. The legislation was passed largely under pressure from protests and marches, and they challenged some Alabama officials who injured and killed people during those African American voter registration events. But we got some relief, we got some consistency across the United States.
Lena, I think maybe we're still having a little trouble hearing you. If you could just continue to speak loud, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me run and close my door because maybe there's background noise as well. So hold on one moment. Okay, can you hear me okay? I'm getting really cozy with my computer, but it seems like maybe it's not liking me as much.
I think it's kind of a matter of it goes up and then it goes down and fades away, then it comes back and then it fades.
Okay.
So I think it's more a matter of consistency, because sometimes it's fine and other times it's really hard to hear.
Okay.
But my ears are very old as well. I will admit that. My ears have been around for a very long time.
Well, very good. I will continue to be very, very cozy to my computer here and see what I can do. Thank you so much for letting me know. I do appreciate it. I know we were just on 1965. I am going to mention briefly just 1966 because a lot of additional things happened that year as well. So we have James Meredith, who was a civil rights activist. He was wounded by a sniper during a solo Walk Against Fear voter registration march between Tennessee and Mississippi. And the next day after that happened, nearly 4,000 African Americans registered to vote. I mean, hey, let's hope, those types of things, unfortunately, were a lot of the driving force behind people getting up and moving and trying to vote, right? That was their protest, is registering to vote. Am I still having sound problems here? Okay. In 1971, this is where we have the 26th Amendment, which granted voting rights to 18-year-olds. And this was sparked by the Vietnam War, and really protests that were demanding a lower voting age, because if you could go out, the idea, and some of you were around during this time, the idea was if you could go out and fight for your country and sacrifice yourself, then you should be able to vote as well. In 1975, English as a second language, I like putting this here, but really amendments to the Voting Rights Act require that certain voting materials be printed in languages besides English. This is huge, absolutely huge. Before this, right, everything was in English. Again, going back to those literacy tests, which we will go through a couple of them as well, and see how difficult this could be for some people. In 1993, I know we skipped way ahead, right? Almost 20 years, the National Voter Registration Act was passed, and this was intended to increase the number of eligible citizens who register to vote by making registrations available at the DMV, public assistance, and disability agencies. So just making that those places where people could go to register more widely available. Jumping ahead to the year 2000, US colonies, citizens without a voice. A month prior to the presidential election, and I remember this, even though I might be a little bit younger than some of you on this call, maybe a little bit older too. A federal court decided that residents living in US territories while citizens could not vote. So these are US citizens who, again, in modern times, we're saying, no, you can't vote. And in case you didn't know who that covers, our US territories are more than just Puerto Rico. We have Puerto Rico, of course, Guam, American Samoa, and the US Virgin Islands. And at that time was nearly 4.1 million people. So an additional 4 million people were stripped of their right to vote, even though they were considered to be citizens of the United States. They cannot vote in presidential elections and don't have any voting representation in the US Congress. In 2001, there was a huge conversation, much like talking about the US colonies, about felons, federal versus state recommendations and what people are actually going to do. The National Commission on Federal Election Reform recommended that all states allow felons to regain their right to vote after completing their criminal sentences. And nearly 4 million US citizens, so very, very close number to the amount that are living in the US colonies, could not vote because of a past felony conviction. And we'll talk about felonies moving forward and what states are doing, states are doing some of it, some states aren't doing it. As we've talked about, there's no set, hey, you have to do this, no set law that's saying that they have to give felons the right to vote. It's just a recommendation. In 2002, we had a Help America Vote Act that was passed, which required states to comply with federal mandate for voting reform. And this was covering many different things: provisional ballots, disability access, centralized computerized voting lists, electronic voting, and requirement that first-time voters present identification before voting. So covering a whole different slew of topics, saying these have to be standardized, states have to follow this. And then in 2013, unfortunately, we saw a rollback to the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling, said that Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. And so that means that those recommendations and requirements from the Voting Rights Act way back in the day in 1965 no longer apply. Whew. So that was your big history lesson. So now we get to talk about the real stuff. Hopefully I'm not missing any questions yet. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. So we are going to move right along to some voter suppression. Fun stuff. There were tons of voter suppression tactics way back in the day, and as you saw throughout time, implemented in different eras, right? In different decades, they had different barriers that they were putting up for people. Whether that be state literacy tests, which again keep coming up and we're going to keep talking about them. And those could be reading or verbal tests that were required in order to be eligible to vote. These, of course, varied state by state, could be city by city, town by town, county by county. And the individual person who was proctoring, I would say proctoring your exam, giving you your test, decided whether you passed or failed, decided whether you were literate or illiterate, excuse me. Poll taxes. Poll taxes were taxes that you had to pay in order to vote, exactly what it sounds like. You had to pay a tax in order to submit your ballot. These could range from $1 to $5 a year, or could be $2 when you show up. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot right now, right? $2, but gosh, can you imagine if we had to pay anything to vote? People would not vote. But back in the day, you know, when we're talking about $2, that's equivalent to $15 today, ish, you know, $15, $16, $14, you know, in that range. That's a lot, especially for our low income folks who are living in poverty, African Americans as well, who don't have that capital to be able to pay those poll taxes. Federal literacy tests, I wanted to mention this, although not a direct hindrance to voting, this is a direct hindrance to citizenship, which then is an indirect hindrance to voting. These are still around today, unlike the state literacy tests and the poll taxes. Federal literacy tests are required for citizenship, for US citizenship, and they have changed throughout history, and really the requirements have changed based off of who is president as well. So whoever's in the White House kind of gets to decide what's going on with that, what types of requirements they want to see, how many questions people have to answer, you name it. Police intimidation. Thankfully, this is not something that we are seeing now too much of, I should say, but arrests, beatings, general intimidation by, at the time, you know, kind of back in the day in that Jim Crow era, especially by white police forces. That was really in full swing for people. And intimidation towards the voter, sometimes their family members and children, were all acceptable and widely spread. Economic retaliation. There were, especially in the South, organizations called white citizens councils, which were made up of white business owners, and they inflicted pain, I would say pain through financial means. And so these would be evictions, firing people from their jobs, boycotting, foreclosures, all sorts of ways that they could hurt people outside of the polls, but really get their message through. And then, of course, as we have seen in movies, as we have heard, we've seen pictures of what people are now calling white terrorism with the Ku Klux Klan, cross burnings, night riders, beatings, church bombings, right? At the time, those were defenders of the Southern way of life. And now we look at it and we say, ooh, that may have been considered terrorism. So let's talk literacy tests. As I mentioned, this was a really, really popular suppression tactic, and thank goodness we don't have them anymore, but there are still pieces that really folks like you in literacy services, why your role is so important, and I'll get to that. But I am so thankful we don't have these anymore, because I don't even know if I would be able to pass some of these things. So I wanted to show a couple of different examples of some literacy tests that were given really in the South, right? When we're talking about Jim Crow laws, we're going to focus on the South a little bit more. So in Alabama, they had a 3-part test. The first part was that you were given a section of the Alabama U.S. Constitution to read aloud. Doesn't sound too bad. Doesn't sound too bad. And in fact, if you are a white applicant applying to vote, you may read something like this: Section 20, that no person shall be imprisoned for debt. Well, if you were a Black applicant, you may be given something like this, Section 260. As much as I could read this to all of you and go through and spend the next few minutes going through this, I think we could probably see the difference here, right? I mean, we're given one person a one-line section to read, where we're giving another person lines upon lines upon lines to read. In addition, so when you go through and you read these, the registrar, who the person that you are trying to prove that you are literate and should be able to vote, any word that you mispronounce, and that pronunciation threshold is up to them. They get to decide what's right and what's wrong. So if you say, I'm trying to think of a word that might have a couple of different ways to say it. But if you, yeah, so we'll just say any of these words, right? If you say something a little bit different than what they would consider to be literate, then they would make a mark to say that you got that incorrect. And additionally, you, in some counties, in addition to this, you had to orally interpret the section as well. So not just read it, but also give them the interpretation. You then either had to copy out these sections by hand or write them down by listening to the registrar give the dictation. So again, if you were that white applicant, you may have been given a written copy to copy down. And if you were that Black applicant, you may have had to listen to that registrar read out this information while you try and keep up with them to write down what they're dictating. Then in Alabama, you also have parts B and C. So we've got 3 parts here. So part A, we're done with. We've read our section, we've written our section, we've interpreted our section. Now we're moving on to parts B and C, which are reading comprehension and additional writing. This is a real test that has the answers written in, and I can send some resources after this as well if you want to check out some additional examples from different states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, all sorts of different places. But as you can see, some of these are what we would consider, right, maybe easy answers, yes or no, multiple choice, write down, you know, a name you know. But there are so many intricacies, and as you look through some of these tests, it's amazing the amount of information that they want people to know that I can't even imagine today asking people. There would be no way that we would have as many voters as we have now if we required some of these tests. So part B and then part C. If you knew any of these answers, you know, take a look at this. If you knew any of these answers, more power to you. There's actually a website that you can go on and take one of these literacy tests and see if you would pass it to be an eligible voter. So that was one. I like to focus on Louisiana as well because theirs is so different. They have a whole slew of questions for you. right? So I thought Alabama's was hard with the 3 different parts, but Louisiana's is confusing. There are questions on here, and I put this on here just to give you an idea of what they were asking. So this was to prove that for anybody who couldn't prove that they went through 5th grade, to then complete and then show that they were literate enough to vote. Draw a line under the last word in this line. Draw a line through the letter below that comes earliest in the alphabet. Things that are like, oh, okay, that's not too bad. There are some things that as I was reading through this, I was like, wait a second, I'm not sure if I know what you mean by this, but that's the point. The point is to confuse people, to make it so that we don't have as many eligible voters, especially in these places where whites were generally more educated. If you didn't have a 5th grade education and you had to go through this test, maybe you couldn't even read it that well. You know, maybe you could read it, but maybe you couldn't write that well. Maybe you weren't interpreting things the way that you needed to interpret them. So looking even at, this is the 3rd page, you got 10 minutes to fill this out. Some of the things that I even had to take some time on and think about a little bit harder were things like number 28, divide a vertical line in 2 equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that's only straight at its bisection of the vertical. Man, I went to Alverno, I was a math major, I think I know lines and shapes, and when I read that the first time, I was like, okay, hold on, how much time do I have to do this test? Can I take a little bit more time to break this down, even for myself? So those were literacy tests. Again, there were so many examples that I could put in here, but I figured just giving you the couple of them that you could see, hopefully you kind of got the idea of how challenging these could be to potential voters. And once we had the Voting Rights Act, and I know I have about 10 minutes, so we're going to get through this. So once the Voting Rights Act went through in 1965, it really changed people's lives. Black voter registration rates in Mississippi increased from 6.7% in 1965 to 59.8% in 1967. And this is according to the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights. You can see in the graph on the right-hand side, just the changes in really Black voter rates, right, and voter registrations. It's just huge increases for people. For a state like Mississippi, that was historically around 40% Black, this made a huge shift in their politics as well. And that change, because of a predominantly white leadership, people were scared, right? And thinking, what is this going to do to our state? What's going to happen? All these people are coming in and changing things and changing laws. What's going to happen next? But really, as we can see, those trends throughout the South really show the impact of the Voting Rights Act in Black communities in just 2 years. And this gap kept getting smaller and smaller throughout time. And I think it was only, I want to say like 6 or 9% difference between Black and white voter registration as we move along, which is really impressive and exciting. But then in 2013-14, we have the Shelby County, oh my gosh, versus Holder. And this was ruling and saying that the Voting Rights Act was determined to be unconstitutional, like I mentioned before. And because of the Supreme Court decision, different voter suppression tactics have been used now. Unfortunately, we know some of them. Things like voter ID laws. I remember when this came into play in Wisconsin, I was working as an election inspector initially when we had our voter ID law come into play. As you can see throughout time, the number of states who had no ID required or strict, non-strict photo ID has been increasing, right? More states are moving towards that strict photo or strict non-photo ID than they had before, simply because we really can now. Taking a look at this map, this is from the ACLU. This is just, hey, these are the states since 2010 who have imposed more restrictive voter ID laws. Of course, Wisconsin is one of them, as I mentioned. Then there's also voter registration restrictions. Across the United States, states have been changing the availability of when people can register, removing same-day registration, making it so that you have to be registered 30 days in advance. If you've moved to a place, right, you can only register to vote if you've lived there so many days. But hey, maybe you moved there 30 days ago, have lived there for 30 days, but your voter registration needed to be in 45 days ago. You know, so there are lots of different tactics that states are using now to move those goalposts for people to make it so that they're not eligible. Of course, voter roll purges. We did have a small win in Wisconsin that they are not purging the voter rolls. That was just called like not too long ago. But you know, cleaning up the voter rolls is super duper important. We need to purge people who are no longer voters, right? People who have passed away, people who are ineligible to vote, all of that. But purging people who are eligible to vote just creates that other barrier because they have to re-register to vote. And then, like I mentioned before, the conversation when it comes to felonies, felony disenfranchisement. So this, again, ACLU coming out. This is a map of the United States with voting rights for formerly incarcerated people. And as you can see, we do have some places that are saying, absolutely, you can still vote upon completion of your sentence. Maybe, you know, if you're out of prison, you can absolutely vote. Everyone has the right to vote. But then we also still have some people with felony convictions cannot vote, or people can't vote at all. They are absolutely, completely, forever disenfranchised. Lots of states are trying to move things a little bit faster to make it so that people can move forward and vote. But this is definitely something that other states are still not budging on.
I have a question about this.
Yeah.
Lena, and maybe you're coming to it.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of tangle, especially I think in Florida, where even though felons come vote, they have to have paid all their fines. People have to have paid all their court fines before they can vote. How does that fit in, and how many states other than Florida are doing that as well?
I actually do not know the answer to that, but maybe I will do some digging and follow up and send a little follow up to Madison with that, because I don't know how many still are requiring people to pay off their fines, because it's almost like
it's not only fines, but any type of
Yeah.
restitution that was required.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost like, and I don't like to say this, but it's almost like a poll tax, right? Because you
Yeah,
can't
exactly.
vote. Yeah, you can't vote until you've paid these things off.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many states still have that requirement. But I will look into it and see if I can find out.
I know that Florida still has it because, well, the last I heard, it went before the Florida Supreme Court and they said that was okay. So I don't know where it is in terms of federal court appeals at this point, but that is a current status I know in Florida.
Right. I am just going to make myself a note and absolutely look into that and see if I can send a follow-up to Madison once I find out. Thank you for that question, though, and I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you. But that is something that I didn't even think about. But yeah, I know that definitely is being talked about in a lot of places. Okay. So I know I'm probably going to go over a few minutes, and I'm so sorry, Madison. I hope that's okay. this is really where I get to get in on some nitty gritty stuff, but I swear I am almost done with voter literacy education and engagement. And Winston Churchill obviously is not from the United States. I just always think that this quote is so funny. I know he meant it seriously, but the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. We know that voter literacy is more than reading. However, I know the folks at Literacy Services of Wisconsin, what you do is so incredibly important in getting people to be literate, right? 1 in 7 Wisconsin adults struggle with low literacy, and this means that they struggle to understand short, simple sentences and perform simple tasks. Obviously, this is a problem when it comes to the polls. If you can't look at a ballot and understand where you're supposed to mark, if you can't interpret what a certain amendment means or whatever, something that you're supposed to be voting on, if you can't do those types of things, how are you going to be an active and informed voter? 24.7% of Milwaukee adults are below the lowest literacy level. Almost 1 in 4 people in Milwaukee. And out of that, right, I also wanted to throw in 21% are below the poverty line, 15% of residents say that their overall health is either fair or poor. And this is important, right? We want people to be involved in this process. We want people to be voting, especially when they turn 18 and they can vote, assuming that they still have all of their rights to vote, right? And this also impacts our children and our youth, because a child of low literacy parents is 72% more likely to have low literacy. Children of low literacy parents are going to grow up to have low literacy. How are we supposed to get people engaged? How are we supposed to get them educated? How are we supposed to get them involved in the political process, or really many other processes, if they are not literate? There are many different challenges with voter education and outreach, in addition to what we look at in Milwaukee. In general, it's assumed that voters are literate, right? When we talk about voting, our voter education series, many of them function with the assumption that voters can read and write, they can comprehend addendums, they know or can learn how to use a computer. Those are all really bad assumptions. And I'm sure, as you folks know, people can look literate, right? Whatever that means. People can function on a day-to-day basis. You can have a conversation. You can do what you need to do to get through life. But if you aren't literate, and the way that we are educating people is with the assumption that they are literate, that is creating huge disparities. Many voter education resources are in English. Yes, we had the act passed that said you have to, or the amendment, to the Voting Rights Act that said you have to have so many things published not in English, in other languages. But the majority of our programs are in English. The majority of our resources are in English. There are, thankfully, in Milwaukee, different organizations, the League being one of them. I'll pat ourselves on the back. And we have different resources in Spanish. There are organizations, especially for Milwaukee, that have things in Hmong as well. But a lot of these programs have resources in English.
I think I'm going to interrupt you too about this.
Yes.
I think also we assume, because I teach citizenship exam preparation,
Yeah.
and I think we assume that if you speak Spanish, you can read Spanish. If you speak Hmong, you can read Hmong. But I think the percentages are very low of the people who can actually read in their home language.
That's a great point.
Especially, I would say the Arabic languages, the languages of North Africa and Southeast Asia. even the Asian languages.
Right.
They don't know how to read in any language. So handing them, oh, here's this wonderful voting thing in Somali.
Right.
They don't have a clue
Right.
whether it's right side up or upside down.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is a good step forward, but I think it doesn't go even close to resolving that issue.
Absolutely.
Just in the interest of time, I think we'll let Lena finish up quick
Oh.
without more questions. We'll save questions for the end. Thank you though for that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, that's great. That is absolutely great insight. And absolutely, right? We're assuming that voters are literate in all sorts of different ways, or that we're assuming that they can understand certain things and they absolutely cannot. Going off of that, some of our outreach efforts are a little outdated, especially for our younger generation of folks. Mailings to home, phone calls to a landline, even phone calls to a cell phone. You know, there are things that people just, especially younger, the youth, they're not vibing with, right? They're not super interested in. And with younger voters on the move, and right, we always focus on the youth are the future, and they really are. What are the types of things that we need to change when it comes to educating them and reaching out to them to mobilize them to vote? So what are the things that we can do? Help making all of our citizens literate. That is what all of you folks are doing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't even thank you enough for the work that you're doing. It is an extremely hard job and so necessary to get people through life, to get them through these complex systems. So you're doing that incredibly difficult work and hoping that, you know, when more citizens can read, write, especially in English, right, like I mentioned, but really if they can read and write in their native tongue, then hopefully they're going to be better equipped to go to the polls and cast that vote. Helping folks prepare for their US citizenship test. I know someone who's just speaking, thank you for doing that. Thank you so much. As I mentioned before, there is that literacy component that's required before someone can become a citizen. There are exceptions to taking the test in English, but really, I mean, if we're seeing a lot of younger folks applying for citizenship or mid-age, I guess, mid-age to older, whatever it may be, then perhaps they don't have those same requirements, or they haven't been in the United States long enough to get those exceptions. We really need those citizens to be able to engage with the test then in English. Of course, new citizens are new voters. And then making sure people use their resources and that we're engaging those younger voters. And there are tons and tons and tons of resources out there. Yes, probably most of them are going to be in English right now, or potentially Spanish, right? But then that's the assumption that we go back on with our literacy piece. But helping guide them to places that you know, that you trust. My recommendation always is nonpartisan as well, can be super helpful in getting them educated and engaged in the process. I put a couple of suggestions there. My Vote Wisconsin, that's obviously where people can go to register. They can check who's on their ballot, all sorts of different things. And a plug for Vote 411, that is a league resource, but as nonpartisan, we have all sorts of great resources on there, questionnaires from candidates, candidate forum recordings. If you have never checked out Vote 411, I would encourage you to do so. And then of course, share the love on that. And then if you're seeing children come in with their parents, engaging them in the conversations, right? Engaging them in those literacy pieces as well, because more educated voters are more engaged voters. There are some upcoming exciting things, and I know I'm super over time, and I'm so sorry, Madison. Some super exciting things on the horizon for voting. So we have HR 1, S1 for the People Act. So I'll kind of zip through these. It's a bill in the United States Congress to expand voting rights campaign finance, changing some of those laws, reducing the influence of money in politics, limiting gerrymandering, all of the things that we really hope to see to make sure that people's votes matter, right? Their voices matter. HR 4 is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And this is establishing targeted process for reviewing voting changes in nationwide, focused on measures that have been used to discriminate against voters, right? Those voter suppression tactics we talked about. And then HR 51, which is Washington, D.C. Admissions Act. So making them an official state of the Union, an official state with official representation, right? So that they don't have that just being able to vote for president, but they have official representation in US Congress. There are some advocacy initiatives that I have to mention that the League is doing. We're participating in the National John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Action Day, which is May 8th, Saturday, May 8th. We hope that you can join in with us, along with many different partners across the city in national broadcasts. There's going to be a votercade, so get in your car and drive along in this parade that we're going to have across the city. Have some activism villages, some different activities planned, all sorts of things. Of course, safe COVID restrictions are still in place, so we are hoping to have this event be very everyone friendly is the hope. More information will absolutely be coming out about that. We have an event on Fair Maps coming up on the 29th, so just a little over a week from now, learning about the commission and drawing fair maps. And then an additional Fair Maps forum as well, and there's going to be a panel of speakers. When you get this, if you get this presentation, those two Fair Maps events are linked out for registration information. Woo. So with that, I know I am over time. You can absolutely contact us if you are interested in getting involved in any way in terms of registering people to vote, getting involved in different activism areas, because it's not just voting that we do so much more. You can obviously contact me. I am one half of a co-chair, so Peg, I should probably put her information on there as well. But we are here for you if you ever have questions, need any information from us, what have you. So